she called and said we could stay up and wait for them to come home. And they came home around 11 o'clock that night. And she said, look what Mom won. And she brought out a bag. And it had silver dollars in it. It was 100 silver dollars that she had won on the reverse raffle or something. And we thought she had just won the lottery. It was, obviously you'd never seen that kind of money before, especially in one spot. And it sounded good, and we got to feel it, we got to count it, and it was quite an experience. But we didn't know we had money, because my dad was, he didn't have to live in a big house and didn't have to have fancy cars and didn't have to put on a big show. And he wanted his kids to be very, very well-mannered and respectful, and to work and to earn money and to be self-sufficient. And so we weren't given a lot. We weren't denied, but we weren't given. And so growing up, Lakewood Country Club was not a rite of passage for us. It was a privilege to be able to come here on certain occasions and to enjoy it. Although it was important to him to play golf here, he didn't live Lakewood Country Club. He enjoyed the people, and he enjoyed the course, and he enjoyed the art of golf. But his family was important too, and we didn't know. We didn't know what we really had, and so.
Tell us a little bit more about your dad. What was his business and profession?
My dad was a dentist, and his office was on 65th in Detroit. And when he graduated from dental school at Case Western Reserve, he was working as a night watchman, and he worked on the trolley cars, and he had a couple other jobs. And we finally got his way through college, got his degree. He opened up a practice there and started. That was the neighborhood he grew up in on 69th in Detroit, and so he started his practice there and did a lot with Mount Carmel Church there. Did all the nuns and the priest teeth and everything, and always gratis. But I remember every year they'd send a case of wine to our house, and we'd think that was phenomenal. But my parents didn't drink, so for us to get a case of wine, he thought it was great to get a box, and he'd end up giving it away to all his patients or his friends. But they didn't drink, so as a result, in that neighborhood, they knew him as Dr. Manco, but the big sign of wealth to him was he didn't live in the neighborhood. He lived in Rocky River. And everybody thought, oh, that's the doctor. He comes in from Rocky River to work in the neighborhood. But, which I guess was another status symbol, wasn't for us. But he worked hard and gave his life in that practice, in that neighborhood. Volunteered, did a lot in Kiwanis and that kind of stuff for the neighborhood rebuilding. And relished his time where he could get out on that golf course. And it was every Wednesday, every Saturday, he was on that golf course. And he'd stick around a little bit longer and play some gin rummy. And but he enjoyed golf, and he'd travel all over the country. And his hobby was collecting golf courses. And every time he'd play a course, he'd keep the postcards, and he'd bring books back of that golf course. And I remember him saying the best course he'd ever played in his life was Pine Valley in New Jersey. And that was something that he just relished, because every year they'd go there with a group, and there were a number of courses in Florida he'd go to. But Pine Valley was the best course because, if you normally shot in the low 80s, you would be guaranteed to shoot in the hundreds. There's no such thing as a lost golf ball, and the caddies would always find it. And so no matter what thistle or brush you were in or sand or whatever, the caddy would find your ball, and you'd have to keep hitting. But he just loved that course. And in fact, Bob Payne, again, living across the street from us, I can remember being in college. It was my freshman or sophomore year. It was 1970, I think. And my mom called up and said, do you know where your dad is? And I said, I think he's in Florida, because every year he would start, instead of retiring, he would take a week off in December and go to Florida, golfing with the guys. And then in January, he'd take 2 weeks off, or maybe 3, And then in February, he'd take 2 weeks off. And in March, he'd take 2 weeks off. And so he would start at the most southern point to make sure it was the warmest. So he'd start in Marathon, and then he'd work his way up to Doral, to Miami, and then he'd work his way up, and I think he ended up somewhere around Jacksonville for his last go-around. But that was probably his March or April trip. So this was one where they were going in Doral, so it had to be January or February. And they were going down with a bunch of guys. And one of the guys, Bob Payne, who lived across the street, he had gone to North Carolina, to Pinehurst, to play one year, and they flew. And the plane was a small charter plane, and they were losing altitude. And the pilot was getting really concerned. And he said, I'm concerned, we're losing altitude, I'm going to try a couple of things, but we may have to drop some of the weight. And Bob Payne was probably 250 pounds, 280 pounds. And Bob Payne, who was normally afraid to fly, he was petrified. And they asked him to, they said, we might have to drop the clubs, because they were stuck in the back of the plane, and they could pitch those out to be some weight. And the pilot was able to solve the problem and land, and after that, Bob Payne said he would never, ever fly again. So instead of flying down with all the guys to Doral or to Pinehurst or Pine Valley or wherever, Bob would always take the train. And he'd leave several days before, he'd take the train, and he would meet them there. So they set up a trip, and I think, again, this one was Doral, and they needed a last-minute throw-in. And so they said to Bob, you know, my dad said, you're going to go to Florida with us. And he said, when? He said, it's next week. And he said, well, I can't, I've got this and I've got that, but I wouldn't have enough time to take the train. He goes, well, we need you, we need an eighth man. And he said, we've tried everybody, you're the only one, and you've got to go. And that's pretty much, they were pretty much like Jackie Gleason and Art Carney on that street. I mean, my dad would tell them, and, you know, so he'd say, okay. So he said, we're going to fly down. He goes, Doc, he says, I just don't want to fly. I really don't. He said, trust me, that was 10 years ago. This is getting really ridiculous, and it's, you know, we need you down there. We're going to take the plane. So we're flying out tomorrow or Thursday or whatever, and he said, oh, he worried about it. He just didn't want to do it. And he would just come over and say, Doc, what about someone? Did you try him? Did you try this guy? He goes, we tried them. They can't do it. You're going. That's the end of it. So they went to the airport, and my mom calls and says, do you know where your dad is? I said, he's in Florida, right? Well, no, he's not. What had happened was the plane took off, and as the plane took off, they had just taken off, the wheels were put up, and the captain gets on the thing, and Bob Payne's sitting there with his hands, you know, normally he was a drinker in those days. He'd be pounding down drinks, but he had just stopped drinking, I think, and he was hanging onto his seats, and they took off, and pilot gets on and says, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? We are being hijacked, and we are now en route to Havana, Cuba. And Bob Payne, my dad said, grabbed onto that seat, went back, his eyes popped out of his head, and he said, what did he say? He said, don't worry about it. We'll get back in time. And sure enough, my dad was in Cuba. They were the only plane ever hijacked out of Cuba, and they had flown from Cleveland. And this man and they weren't too worried, my dad said, because they found out later the man was on there with his children, and they were seeking asylum in Cuba. So they went to Havana. They got a picture on the front page of the Plain Dealer of Bob Payne and my dad standing in front of U.S. Customs when they arrived back in Miami. And I had that picture framed, and I've got it in my office at work. But it was one of those harrowing things. And Bob Payne said he would never, ever get on a plane again. His life was golf, but it didn't matter if he was going to Cuba. He knew he still had his clubs, and they'd eventually get back into Florida. I mean, he said, they thought maybe they could even, they play golf down there, but they only held him for like an hour or two, and then they brought him back. But that was it.
Your dad was very, very, he was my locker mate. His locker was right next to mine. And I was working in, all his accolades of winning everything, and the old lockers we had, the sleeves, and there would be lined up from top to bottom, maybe 15 of these. And here's my name up there, and 0. When I would bring a guest out, I would take my name slot out, and I would put it on his locker, and his name would go on mine. And I'd get to my locker, and they'd say, "Oh my God, Vic, you're really playing golf." I said, "Yeah, I play around with the game." and then I'd switch it. But we had lots of fun together. I mean, your dad was just very, very personal, very intense, very, very honest, and dedicated at everything he did. And we had a lot of fun. And I told him about that. He said, "Well, here's the combination if you ever want to use it and really play it all the way through."
Right, right.
So
He had...
that's great.
Do you remember any stories of his accomplishments out here that
Oh, yeah.
he was most proud of?
Yeah, he like you said, he was a real competitor. He loved golf, and he'd take his lessons all the time. He'd always be on that driving range, and he was so intense. And my brother would pick up with him, and they would go to the driving range, and I would sit there watching them. I had no interest, and he would work on his game constantly. Well, there were a number of stories about him, but one that really stands out in my mind. He was in a tournament, and he was in a sudden death match, and I don't know if it was for the club championship in the B class, but it was getting down to the final stages of the match, and he was playing with who was the gentleman? I knew it. I was not prepared to tell this story, so I can't remember the guy's name.
Okay.
Andy.
Hornick?
No, it wasn't Andy Hornick. But anyway, it'll come back to me. So he was playing with this guy, and in fact, he was the one that was telling me the details of the story. And he said that your dad and I were playing, and he tied me on the 18th hole. So we went into sudden death, and we went to number 1, and we tied. We went to number 2, and we tied. And he said, we tied every hole until we got to number 5. And he said, we tee off on number 5. And he said, there's not a word spoken between the two of us. Your dad was not an outspoken man, and he was very quiet and humble. And he said, and I kept my mouth shut, but I was so competitive. He said, I was going to beat your dad in the worst way. And he said, on number 5, I teed off, and my ball hit the green and rolled up. He said, I was like a foot from the cup, just below the hole. He said, I couldn't hold it back anymore. He said, I walked back, I took my club, and I slammed it in my bag, and I said, take that one, Manco. He said, your dad got up, hit the ball, hit the green, rolled up, went in the cup. He said, your dad didn't say a word. He just got back, put the club back in the bag, got in his cart, and drove back to the clubhouse. Never said a word. He said, I was so mad. I was so shocked.
Oh my God.
But that's how my dad was. That would punish somebody more than saying anything you could say about him.
Wow. That is a story that I
Yeah.
let me tell you.
Yeah.
I've never heard that one.
Yep.
Wow. Well, that's great.
And unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but I...
That's okay. We can have
Yeah,
yeah, back
right,
in later. But,
right.
the idea is that it's
So, yeah, he, as you said, he had tons of tags on his locker. It was like the Hall of Fame. And in fact, when he passed away, my brother took the locker because they were redoing the lockers, putting the wood lockers in. So we took it and we made it into a frame, framed it and put it on the wall. So
Right.
for his memorabilia.
Yeah.
So we have that to this day.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So,
Oh, that's great. Well, you've played golf here for a number of years and so on, and I know that I see you out here and enjoy it. And the same thing you're doing with you, your mom and dad did with you. You enjoyed it. You played and the children and so on.
mhm,
It's a great place to grow up as such.
right.
And it's part of life. And we're good
Yeah.
for it.
When I joined in '85, I did it because it was $10,000, I think, to join, and the business was making money, and there was a tax break if you joined a club. at the time. So I thought, well, I got nothing to lose. So I told my dad, I said, do you think I should join? And he goes, well, just remember, there's two kinds of people that join this club. He said, there's the ones that love to play golf and want to enjoy it for all that it offers. He said, there's the other kind that join to sell. And he said, make up your mind what you want to do, because if you choose that you want to go in there and get a lot of business, he said, you will never have a moment's peace. He said, if you go in there because you're going to enjoy and have fun, and he said, enjoy golf, he said, that's a different experience. And so I made up my mind that that's what I was going to do. And so I don't think many people even know what I do out here, and they would never bring it up. But I wasn't much of a golfer. And so I was trying to take up golf, and my dad would work with me and try to teach me, and it was such a frustration for him because, he always said, quit, you're chopping from the telephone. I just didn't have the swing. Mm-hmm. And he was a natural golfer, and my brother was a natural golfer, and I could have swore that when my brother hit, I think he was a 7 handicap, a number of years ago, and I said, you're not my brother. There's no way you could be genetically attached to me. And then he got down to a 3. And I was going up. I was like a 21, and I'm thinking, we cannot be in the same ballpark. I mean, how could you be like this? And I must have been the adopted one, because you're just like Dad. You're a great